Welcome to the Authority File. I'm Bill Mickey, your host and the editorial director at Choice. For the last few Authority File series, I've been telling you all about our new podcast called Patron Driven. It's coming up later this month, and we're really excited for you to hear it. It's going to be much different than the Authority File. It's a lot like the narrative-style podcasts many of you have probably listened to. It's much more story-driven. Season 1 is a 5-part series that follows 4 librarians through the destruction of the Lone Star College Kingwood Library after Hurricane Harvey, the 2 years it took to rebuild, and the new space, services, and relationships that emerged from it all. It's such a great story. It's got drama, grit, perseverance, and it's a terrific library success story. Patron Driven debuts in late June, wherever you get your podcasts. You can visit our website, choice360.org, to learn more about it. Click on the librarianship drop-down to find the Patron Driven landing page where you can access more info and sign up for email updates. While you're there, you'll find behind-the-scenes bonus content for the new program, and you can check out the new trailer for the upcoming series. Okay, so back to the Authority File. We've got another great set of episodes on deck, and my guest for the next 4 weeks is Jill Grunenwald, Marketing and Communications Specialist at OverDrive, the ebook and audiobook platform provider that works with public and academic libraries. Jill's got a fascinating background in book publishing and librarianship, and we'll dive into that along with her unique role at OverDrive, which includes producing a podcast that she created called Professional Book Nerds. We'll also look at OverDrive's efforts to move into the higher education market, its response to the COVID-19 crisis, lending models, and the company's app platform. In this first episode, brought to you by OverDrive, Jill and I talk about her previous life as a prison librarian fresh out of library school and the memoir she published about her experiences there. We also get a behind-the-scenes peek at our Professional Book Nerds podcast and some of her favorite author guests. All right, Jill, welcome to the program. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
Sure. So let's talk about your background a little bit. I'm very interested to hear about your experiences before you arrived at OverDrive. You've got a background in librarianship. I'm wondering if you can tell us a bit about that experience.
Sure. So I actually started working in libraries when I was in high school. I worked as a page at the library in my hometown, and worked there through undergrad and a little bit after I graduated from college. I received my master's in library and information science from the University of Kentucky. And my first job out of grad school, I was a librarian at a male prison on the far west side of Cleveland. I was there for a couple of years. Then I started working at a career college for about 5 years. And 5 years ago, joined OverDrive on their collection development team. And I have been working on the marketing team for about 2 years.
Okay. So I have to ask, what was it like working as a prison librarian?
I get asked that a lot. Yeah, it was actually really challenging in a lot of good ways. I was the only librarian, so I did all of the work. And it was a good and very quick introduction into being a librarian after grad school because I didn't have anyone else to rely on. The library itself was pretty small, but it was very popular among the men that I worked with.
Mm-hmm.
And they read a lot of the same books that I would read, and, popular fiction. They would bring in the New York Times bestseller list and want the books off of there. And I actually have written a memoir about my experiences called Reading Behind Bars, which came out last year. So if anyone wants more information about what it's like being a prison librarian, you can find it there.
Excellent. Well, congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
So you joined OverDrive 5 years ago, and so you mentioned you were in sort of a collection development role. Can you describe what that was like?
Sure. So we on the staff librarians at OverDrive work in territories with the sales team, and our role, their role now, is about sort of helping libraries manage their collection and whether that's, helping them purchase or recommending titles that they purchase. We also can help them put books. When you go to your OverDrive site or your library's OverDrive site, you'll see books on the front page there in curated collections, and we help a little bit with that. Yeah, so I did that for a few years and worked with some really wonderful librarians, but then switched to marketing and now work on the as a communications specialist. So I get to sort of combine my writing background and my library background all in one job.
Oh, that's great. So, um, let's drill down to sort of since, Choice and the Authority File, our audience is primarily the academic library world. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about your role and work with academic libraries and what you're doing with them.
Sure. So my role as a communications specialist, I help with the communications and marketing for our public libraries, international, and then also academic.
Mm-hmm.
And for academics specifically, actually, if you have seen any of the OverDrive Choice presentations in the last 2 years, I've probably made that presentation deck. So I work closely with our academic team to help sort of identify where we can help them in terms of communicating the features and OverDrive as a service for their library.
Mm-hmm.
I also help manage. I do manage the OverDrive blog, where I write articles and publish the ones written by coworkers, and I also co-host a podcast through OverDrive as well.
Yeah, I wanted to dig into the podcast a little bit. Can you tell us about that?
Right. So it's called the Professional Book Nerds.
Mm-hmm.
About 2 or 3 months after I started working at OverDrive, I realized that we spent a lot of time talking about books all the time. We just sort of in pockets of people would just talk about what we had been reading, what we were looking forward to. And so I made a comment to my coworker, Adam, that we should just have a podcast. And that's sort of how it started. So we do episodes twice a week. On
Mm-hmm.
Mondays, we have author interviews. Most of them are done over the phone. Occasionally, we get to do live ones at our local public library. And on Thursdays, we have sort of book chats, recommendation type things. Sometimes it's just, what are you reading right now? What have you read? Other times they're based around a genre. We've done mystery ones, romance ones. And it's just talking about books a lot all the time. It's actually really great.
Yeah, no,
And
I
then
can't. That sounds pretty fun.
yeah,
Uh,
my poor TBR just keeps getting longer and longer after every episode.
I'm sure. Uh, so you've talked about some of the few authors who've become friends of the show. I'm wondering if you could talk about who they are.
Absolutely. So there's a couple. The first would probably be Marie Benedict. She writes historical fiction. She finds women in history who perhaps have not quite gotten their due and writes books about them. She's written about Einstein's first wife. She had one just recently come out about Winston Churchill's wife. And she has been on our podcast, I think 3 times, 4 times,
Hmm.
perhaps. I think for every book she's been on, but she's fairly local to us, and so she's actually come to our office quite a few times. We get to do those in person at our office. She's delightful. She's a big fan of the podcast. Our very first interview that my co-host Adam did was Marie Nykamp. She writes young adult, and she has also been on a couple of times. And Adam talks about how when he first met her, her first book wasn't even out yet, and now she's this huge New York Times best-selling young adult author. She's written graphic novels for DC Comics now. She's just doing really remarkable things, and we have a very special place in our heart for her. And then Mallory O'Meara is also a podcast co-host. She co-hosts the Reading Glasses podcast, and she had a book come out last year, I believe, called The Lady from the Black Lagoon, which is all about the woman who created the creature from the Black Lagoon from the film, who is sort of lost to history. And so Mallory has written it sort of part biography about the woman, and then sort of part mystery almost, as she herself sort of is like learning, and she sort of writes her process about learning and the research process she did to find out about her. So Mallory, again, has also, we've both met her in person. She's wonderful. And those are just three of the three writers who we've had on and who we consider friends outside of the podcast.
Excellent. I'm wondering if, in your conversations with authors, if you could tell us, I'll admit that I have a little bit of professional interest in this question myself, but how, what's your approach when you have an author on the program in terms of, what you ask them? I mean, do you start with the book that they just wrote, or is it more personal? What sort, how would you describe the conversations that you have with your guests?
We try to have a very conversational tone. We have questions in advance most of the time. And yes, we start with whatever book they have just published or is coming out. That's usually how they come to us, is that they're promoting something, and we talk about that. And then from there, depending on if there's other things we know about them, we'll sort of start to talk about other books as well. There are a handful of authors who we just don't even have questions in advance for, because we know them and their books well enough, or we don't necessarily feel the need to prepare. Like when Marie Benedict comes to our office to have a conversation with us, we don't have questions in advance. And sometimes occasionally we'll interview authors separately, and that's usually if one of us is a really big fan of that author, and we'll just go interview them ourselves. And for those, we usually also don't have questions in advance, because we know their work well enough to just sort of record us talking with them without a formal process.
Right. So there are some authors you're both fans of that you've had on the show. I mean, can you talk about some of the ones you were most excited about? Not to give anybody preferential treatment or anything, but
No,
or someone who you might have been a little bit nervous about having on the show because they mean so much to you.
Yes. I can actually give you two examples. So I said that we sometimes do live interviews with our friends at the Cuyahoga County Public Library, and that started fairly early in the podcast. I mean, we hadn't even been around for a year when we started getting invited to come do these live in front of an audience interviews. And one of the first ones we did was actually the actor Alan Cumming, who has written memoir books. And my co-host and I are both huge theater nerds. And Alan was in town to both promote one of his books, and also he was doing a performance singing his cabaret downtown Cleveland. And so getting to meet him in person and just like be on stage with him, asking him questions all week, we were just in this sort of like dream world of like, this is really happening.
Yeah, that's pretty impressive.
Okay. And again, so like that was right around the time we'd hit a year. And so to be like in that place after a year. And, in the beginning, when we started this podcast, we would have to go to publishers and ask them for authors to interview. And like we had to sort of pitch ourselves. And then after a while, it became clear that publishers were pitching us, which was also very surprising. And so last year, I think in the spring, I had an email from a publicist asking if I wanted to interview Jennifer Weiner, who had her new book, Mrs. Everything, come out. And I am a huge, huge fan of hers. And it was a very surreal moment because I had been planning on asking them if I could interview her, but they came to me first. And I
Oh.
think that was one of those moments like, oh, we actually have something here. And that was one where I had to sort of like not totally fangirl on the phone when I talked to her, because I'm such a huge fan of her books. And she was just as delightful as I could have hoped that she would be.
Good. That's excellent. Um, so, as we're recording this, we're in the middle of the COVID-19 pandemic, and we're all working from home. And I'm wondering, as a book lover, if you could tell us a little bit about, or mention maybe your top 2 or 3 go-to titles during lockdown, and why you've selected those.
Sure. So, one of my absolute favorite books is The Other Boleyn Girl by Philippa Gregory. I am a bit of a amateur Tudor historian, and the book itself, the novel, is not exactly the most accurate historically, but I absolutely love this book, and my poor copy has been read so many times it's falling apart. So that's one of those comfort read books that I'm very familiar with, and I read that fairly on into all of this. I also am someone who kind of leans into things when it comes to books and the world, and so I also read The Hot Zone by Richard Preston, which is about the Ebola virus, and I know that there are other people sort of reading those kinds of pandemic and epidemic books just to sort of have, I can't even explain why I find it comforting in that way, but I don't know. It's just sort of, okay, well, this is what's happening. Let's read about what has happened previously.
Right.
There's so much unknown. Maybe there's something to take away. And then Samantha Irby is a comedian. She has a new book out called Wow, No Thank You. And if you're looking for any kind of lighthearted books because you need something funny, I highly recommend her novels. Her collections, her essay collections, especially if you can get them on audiobook. She reads them herself, and they're just hysterical and is a nice distraction from everything else that's happening in the world right now.
That's excellent. You just heard from Jill Grunenwald. Jill is a marketing and communications specialist at OverDrive. Join us next week when we continue our conversation and talk about some of the ways OverDrive is responding to the COVID-19 pandemic, especially how the role of ebooks may be evolving in the near term, and how the company is making inroads to academic libraries.
In terms of how we're responding, we've actually started working closely with our publishing partners to try and provide more access to content. A lot of publishers have stepped up and have reduced pricing or have changed their lending models to open up access, which is greatly appreciated. Really, our role is just sort of helping the librarians, whether it's the college and academic librarians or the public librarians. They're providing this essential service to their communities, whether it's the students or the public, and we're just there to kind of help them during this time, connecting books to readers.
If you like what you hear, rate us or give us a review on your podcast platform of choice, and if there's a topic you'd like us to cover, drop me a line. I'm at bmickey@ala-choice.org. As always, sponsorship and advertising for the Authority File podcast are handled by Choice's advertising manager, Pam Marino, and all of our episodes are produced by Choice's senior digital media producer, Mark Dirks, and digital media assistant, Sabrina Kofer. That's all for this week. Thanks for joining us.